Oh my God, I'm back to doing what I love to do, you know, spreading knowledge to the public, spreading knowledge to the youth. You know what I mean? All right, you know what? Let me just get to the topic. Stop blaming stress for everything. Please stop blaming stress for everything. I just had my finals this week, bro, and I'm not gonna lie, it was a pretty hectic week. But recently, I looked into what actually caused most of my stress, and it was not like some mechanical issue that I had or some like issue that I had with my academics, where it's like I was just like so behind on a class that I had to like lock in last minute. It was never really anything like that. My issues were what propelled me into stress was the anticipation of failure, right? So to give you guys a little bit of a backstory, last spring, I believe, of my semester, I'm at community college right now. I ended up getting like three B's, and the semester before that, I had two B's already. So I'm kind of five B's in, and when you have five B's and you're trying to transfer to UCLA, it's kind of hard to say the least. And I've experienced many days recently and over the last year kind of dreading and having like very inconsistent and rigid days of just complete stress spirals. So I would go to sleep at like 4 a.m. one day, having like the worst stress spiral of my life, getting like acid refluxes, waking up early in like overnight, having like complete like having like multiple visits to the bathroom because that's one of my compulsory mechanisms. It's like I have to go like take a little leak whenever I feel like really stressed, you know, and I've had to realize something that it's like it's just all in my head, but somehow whatever is in my head is perverting all of these physiological stressors, right? All these physiological responses in my body that's affecting me really badly. And I feel like as a society, we wake up every single day dreading stress. Like over 50% of Americans report stress to be one of, if not the biggest causal factor for their mental health problems. For most people, it's normally work stress in regards to their financial situation and just in regards to the actual like work that they have to do in their jobs. But like also, it could also be family stress, right? Or home stress. It could be like marital problems, poor nutrition, problems with children, substance abuse as well. That contributes a lot. And it almost seems as though anything bad which happens in one's life is to be blamed to have been caused by high stress. But I think my question when it comes to this is like you have to really take a step back and realize like a lot of people do blame stress, and I realized that a lot of medical reports and articles and just a lot of analysis has been conducted to show that stress is a major causal factor of physiological problems. But I want to know of like whether if how much influence the situational cues has, because is your circumstance really the issue, or is it the way you interpret of your circumstances, right? Like let us suppose a girl named Mariah and Johnny were or a guy named Johnny were to take the same calculus final. Mariah, being like the preppy student that she is like, oh, like she has to start studying for the test like 2 or 3 weeks down like before. And like Johnny on the other hand, like literally studies for the day before the test, or like, let's say the 2 or 3 days before the test. I'm just trying to convey my logic here, because Johnny, instead of studying for the test, is probably like binge watching Netflix or going on Prime to watch The Invisibles, or he's like doom scrolling and whatnot. And Mariah, on the other hand, is like actually trying to perform better. She's like actually trying to understand the material and recall the information to do well. Now, normally speaking, in general, as a society, we have realized, or just within academic institutions, studies have been conducted to show you that, like, if you study earlier on for a test that you are anticipating, then you tend to perform better. Normally, like generally, because of the spacing effect. So the spacing effect is like this phenomenon where it's like people space out smaller study sessions over a longer period of time, overindulging in like aside instead of indulging in like shorter but like sooner cram sessions, people indulge in like smaller study sessions but over a longer period of time, right? But let's suppose that like Mariah starts to fail or somehow does better worse than she expected to. like because of the fact that instead of studying smaller times over that 2 or 3 weeks, she actually has a stress spiral and she's like stressing out and she's like really nervous, really jittery. She's going through like brain fog and stuff for 3 or 4 5 hours. So she ends up studying like 3 or 4 5 hours every single day over the last 2 or 3 weeks. When in theory it should take her like maybe 1 or 2 hours. I mean, calculus finals are pretty hard to study for, but I'm just saying that as like an example, right? So like the interpretation of arousal is also important to decode if stress is actually helpful for you or not. And there's like studies all the way back in the 60s. There was a study by Schrader and Singer, which goes to show that like which goes to show that physiological arousal has a great deal plays a great deal in how we interpret of situations. Or like there's two different Confederates were placed in settings where they either acted angrily or arrogantly toward experimental participants, or they acted euphorically. So there was this study. There were four groups, and two of the experimental groups had been injected with epinephrine. If you don't know what epinephrine is a neurotransmitter involved in physiological arousal. It is, and it is also interlinked with cortisol as well. And one experimental and one control group was placed into a condition whereby they had to interact with somebody who either acted angrily towards them or happily towards them after being injected. So the experimental groups were the people who were injected with epinephrine, and then in control groups were people who were offered a placebo. And the dosages were healthy dosages. I just want to point that out. What they did find out is that the people who had to interact with the person who was rude to them after being injected with epinephrine had interpreted the situation negatively, in the sense that they had reacted arrogantly back to that person. And you see like a difference between like the control group of people who reacted to the angry person, as opposed to like the people who were injected with epinephrine. They just had so much more like significantly stronger responses. um, and people who were injected with epinephrine, who actually interacted with the person who was euphoric and was like nice to them, they were much more kindly. They exhibited more kindness and more, I guess, satisfaction, if that's the right feeling, but they exhibited more positive emotions toward the Confederate who reacted positively to them, as opposed to the control group whereby the person was, whereby the people were offered a placebo injection and they had to interact with the person, right? So what they found out was that obviously like arousal harbors a lot of stress, because physiological arousal in and of itself has to do a lot with stress. Physiological arousal raises your cortisol, right? But the situation dictated whether the stress turned out to be good or bad, right? So I think that to some extent you have to stop blaming stress, and you have to look into your appraisal, because the way you interpret stress can go in multiple different ways. And I'm not denying that. Like, am I denying that stress is dangerous, guys? No. Excess stress can be definitely dangerous. But I'm just trying to tell people that, like, stress science is just much more nuanced, right? Like, you have to understand the influence your situation has on you before you go around blaming the actual feeling of stress itself for, the problems that you face, either physiologically, psychologically, you know, outwardly, you know. Like for me, example, like if I don't know if I discussed this in my previous video, but I am getting into running more now. I used to run a lot all the time, but I stopped running to try to hit the gym and focus on going to the gym 5 days a week instead. But I recently gravitated back towards running for my mental health, and I love running now. And what I've realized is that like when I'm running and I'm down to like the fifth or the sixth mile, stress can actually be a good thing. You know why? Because like it keeps me awake, it keeps me motivated, and it keeps me feeling challenged. So it keeps me awake, keeps me motivated, keeps me feeling challenged. And even if I'm at like the fifth or sixth mile, like imagine this, right? I'm at the beach, bro. I'm running in the beach. I have my headphones on. I'm listening to like some good music, that Travis Scott and whatnot. And like 5 or 6 miles in, my legs start hurting, my abdominals start cramping. Yet somehow I'm feeling happy. Somehow the endorphins are helping me. Somehow my fingers are looser. Somehow I feel the need to run more. Why is that? Because I'm not interpreting the physiological stressors as a threat, which actually could be a problem for some runners, because the runners could experience pain and they would still just keep running, because they a lot of runners, they don't interpret the physiological stress as a threat. They interpret it as a challenge. So I'm going to spend a great amount of this video speaking of the difference between challenge appraisal and threat appraisal, right? So a challenge appraisal occurs when a person views of a situation as a challenge to overcome or endure. And then a threat appraisal, on the other hand, occurs when a person views of a situation as something to be like frightened of and to succumb to. So like let us keep in mind, like obviously to go about explaining the significance of appraisal, we have to go back to discuss like actual brain parts involved in how we interpret of situations, right? So the prefrontal cortex is involved in planning, decision making, self-regulation. So just basically executive functioning. Um, as somebody with ADHD, I wish I had a better prefrontal cortex, but anyways, like the ventral medial region of the prefrontal cortex is a specific region which has been attributed to assigning subjective value for the tasks that we pursue, right? So individuals assign subjective value towards their goals, as we obviously do. Some people view money more than some people value attaining a higher paying job more than others because they just impose this higher subjective value, and their ventral medial region of the prefrontal cortex is linked in relation to that function, right? So, and then this ventral medial region also has mesolimbic dopaminergic areas. So we all know that I mean, for the people who do not know, dopamine is involved in motivation. So dopamine is a neurotransmitter in your brain involved in motivation to pursue tasks. It is involved in, so basically there's a lot of different things. I don't know if you've been on the internet, they speak a lot about dopamine detox. The reason why they speak of dopamine detox is because dopamine can either be good or bad in relation to how we get dopamine, right? So one thing we've realized is that like the mesolimbic dopaminergic areas in the VP, I don't know if it's VPMC or VPMFC, but ventral medial prefrontal cortex. VPMFC makes more sense. So the VPMFC, it has mesolimbic dopaminergic areas that produces dopamine, which is helpful for us to feel motivation in order to pursue our respective rewards, right? So another area which is kind of interlinked with the VPMFC is the DACC, which is the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex. And that region is more so involved in effort, like the employing of actual effort. And what we've realized is like the VPMFC, you know, helps with motivation, helps you reassign, like helps you assign value towards goals. And then the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex works alongside the VPMFC to actually pursue those goals with actionable behaviors, and to put effort into it. You don't want to put too much effort, so the VP, like the DACC, also regulates the amount of effort you put into things, even when it comes to like your thoughts for some to some extent. So like when looking at stress, like workplace stress or academic stress, it might be worth it to define your goals better as well, because your brain is not just thinking of the mere goal, it is thinking of how to pursue the goal, it is thinking of how to assign value to the goal, it is thinking of how to tolerate the discomfort that comes from pursuing the goal. And that's why um like discussing challenge and threat appraisal is important, because you have to understand how your brain works to some extent. Not everybody can get it down. There's been hundreds of years of neuroscience research. Not any of us have ever figured out how our brain completely works at all. So your brain, which constantly balances effort, value, and reward, also has to handle stress. So you have to understand how your brain interprets stress. So make sure your goal pursuit is in par with the amount of stress that you're willing to endure, right? So this means that if you are, like, let's say if you are working towards some big goal, like making partner at a firm, and you have to work 20-hour days, 5 days a week to pursue that goal, understand that your stress has some sort of an attribution to it, right? Obviously, like you can go back and say this is why something happened, this is why like X caused Y, right? But if you're not somebody who has that kind of a big goal, but you're still working those amount of hours when you're not in a necessity to do so, maybe, like, this might be cheap advice, so but just maybe not work that much, you know what I mean? Like maybe try to achieve a better work to like work life balance. Now I don't personally believe in the work life balance, but if you're somebody who is able to get a better routine going for yourself that still keeps your mental health intact, maybe like don't work so hard if your goals are not that high. Like it sounds cheap advice, but cheap advice is the best, right? So like, don't blame it on stress. Blame it on your dysregulation. Like, blame it on the fact that you're unable to like know what your limits are. Understand your limits. That's very important. And like, we can also look at this through the lens of cardiovascular responses as well. We don't have to just look at brain regions. So like, when appraising of a situation as a threat, as we spoke of earlier, threat appraisal, your pre-ejection period rate is, which is, so the PEP, the pre-ejection period, is responsible for initiating sympathetic nervous system activity, so SNS activity. So your SNS is involved in fight or flight, right? And what the PEP does is it actively shoots up two double times as opposed to like when you perceive of a situation as a challenge. So like your SNS, your SNS, sympathetic nervous system, which is involved in inducing fight or flight. So it is directly attributed to anxiety, physiological stress, high cortisol, etc. Shoots up twice in terms of activation when like you appraise of a situation as a threat, right? So this also causes something else, which is kind of interlinked, which is called the total peripheral resistance. So this is when, though this total peripheral resistance is also significantly higher when you perceive of a situation as a threat, as opposed to a challenge. So higher total peripheral resistance means that blood flow is a lot more blocked, and it is important to realize that like a good heart rate or a stable cardiovascular like health and whatnot, it depends a lot on how flexible your your heart rate is. So heart rate variability for people who perceive of situations as a challenge is significantly higher as opposed to people who perceive of a situation as a threat. Now, obviously, the heart rate variability is still taking some damage when you perceive of a challenge as a threat. But remember that in life, things happen. You have to endure failure. You have to endure problems. But it's important that you endure the problems as whilst perceiving of them as a challenge, as opposed to as a threat, right? Because higher total peripheral resistance would mean that blood flow is a lot more blocked. So therefore, you experience lower levels of like good breathing, and you also worsen your anxiety. So, is it worth it to appraise of situations as a threat? In certain situations, like if a bear is chasing you, you should probably not interpret that situation as a challenge. Like going back to the whole man versus bear thing. If I see a bear, I'm gonna run. I'm gonna perceive of that as a threat. I'm not gonna perceive of it as a challenge and try to wrestle the bear. I'm not Khabib. I can't do that, right? But if you are somebody who can, hey, GG's to you. But I would never do that, right? So it really depends on the person themselves. But I would like to go about like just to tell you guys like three actionable steps or just three steps to like how to appraise of a situation as a challenge rather than as a threat, right? So the first thing that you can do is to acknowledge what causes the situation to be challenging in and of itself. There was a study back in 2004, I believe it was by Feldman and colleagues, right? And the study was about the study actually compared two different experimental groups, whereby like one experimental group had to endure this task of like reading out loud to the public within like like an environment, basically like a classroom environment, right? And then the other experimental group was to perform like an evaluative speech. So they were given the task of coming up with a speech that they will be graded on. What we've realized is like when a person is about to prepare for an evaluative speech, their stress levels and anxiety levels, like the propensity to experience high stress and anxiety, shoots up so much higher as opposed to somebody who is just about to read out loud, right? So we have this tendency, like when it comes to people who are afraid of public speaking, you might think that your fear is being caused by the fact that you have to speak out loud in front of the people. Obviously, this means that you have a propensity for social anxiety, right? But I think it's important to acknowledge that, like, maybe it's not the actual fact that you're speaking to people. Maybe it's more so the fact that you have to be evaluated when you speak to people. Like, if you're reading out loud, you're technically still reading out loud to people. Why is it that when you're being evaluated for a speech, your anxiety goes up so much higher? Because you're anticipating failure. You're anticipating failure. It's all in your head. You're anticipating failure. That's what causes you to be socially anxious. You're anticipating failure. right? So the second task, so the first one, obviously, acknowledge what situation. So it's important for you to acknowledge what causes the situation to be challenging. Are you afraid of people speaking bad about you? Are you afraid of getting a bad grade on the speech? Is that what is causing anxiety for you? Do not think that because of the fact that you are to anticipate failure when being evaluated for a public speaking task, do not take that as a cue to like never speak out and loud in public again. Like a lot of people do that, right? Like they would take a test, they would fail the test, and they'll just conclude that they're bad at math. Like if you failed a calculus test, like don't conclude that you're bad at math. Please don't do that. That's a very it's a very bad path. It's a very negative path to go down. And I know that. Trust me, I know that from experience. Please don't internalize please do not internalize things that you can work towards improving. So the second step I would say is like also identify causes of procrastination. If you're somebody who does procrastinate, like people with avoidant personalities face a greater challenge when it comes to dealing with procrastination and burnout. And the reason why is because stress in and of itself has a strong correlation with procrastination and burnout. But what purports procrastination is not mere avoidance, but it's like the expectation of the temporary relief you get, right? Like if you were to procrastinate, if you were to lay on your bed instead of studying for a test on your desk, if you were to just lay on your bed and doom scroll, you're getting some kind of temporary relief. So you're expecting some kind of temporary relief from the task before you actually perform the task. And because of that, you tend to procrastinate, right? So identify and reassign the subjective value for things that provide you temporary relief, and also ensure that it is lesser than what you get from enduring the stressful task. Like, identify why you value that little, like 1 or 2 hours of like meaningless doom scrolling that you do, and identify why that value is higher and propels you to do that over like studying for a stressful task. Because you know why it's hard for you to study for a task that you're gonna fail in? Because when you doom scroll, you're not failing. Are you succeeding? No. You might be technically failing in the sense that you're losing time, but you're not. You can't anticipate failure doom scrolling. Nobody gets graded on doom scrolling. Nobody's gonna get fucking graded on doom scrolling, bro. So that's one. That's the reason why your brain causes you to procrastinate and to be burnt out, is because you constantly expect you have trained your mind. We've all trained our brains to constantly expect temporary relief over delayed outcomes, right? Or over delayed gratification. We have trained our minds to, or our brains to pursue instant gratification or delayed gratification. And that's the reason why you should also avoid falling into the just be disciplined bro trap, because sometimes it can also be due to the fact that situations of propel you to do something, right? Like going back to the public speaking task, if you are somebody who has a social anxiety, if you have an anxiety disorder, you're generally more susceptible to the fight or flight state. So like your heart rate increases, your blood vessels constrict, you might have panic attacks, your pupils definitely dilate, and like you tend to sweat profusely. So like I'm not saying that discipline is not good. Discipline is very important. If you're somebody who's very disciplined, or if you're somebody who has generally high self-regard for personal discipline, by all means keep doing what you're doing. But all I'm saying is, even if Mariah maintains more discipline in the sense that she starts studying 2 or 3 weeks before, Johnny might lock in better if he has more to lose. So like if he got a bad grade on the test prior to the final, he's probably going to work, like he's probably going to lock in more when he's going to study for the test a day or two before. And that's where people with ADHD go wrong. A lot of people with ADHD like study for a test a day or two before, right? So 3 steps: to acknowledge what causes the situation to be challenging. That's the first one. Identify causes of procrastination. Please do that. And also avoid falling into the just be disciplined bro trap. Do not fall into the just be disciplined bro trap, please. Right? Remember that our brain behaviors are regulated by nervous system responses. There are some therapeutic frameworks that you can use to self, I guess, self teach, like I guess kind of like train yourself to kind of psychologically regulate these responses or interpret these responses better. Like cognitive behavioral therapy is one thing that you can do. So like what Mariah can do on top of preparing for the exam is like she can use CBT to like assign the subjective value of the final. So Mariah can basically be like, oh, like she needs to work hard to do well in this final, but like one exam wouldn't shape her life, right? And also in the next video, I'll speak of implementation intentions. Thank you.